A History of Central Banking and the Enslavement of Mankind by Stephen Mitford Goodson. Chapter 2. The Hidden Origins of the Bank of England. All great events have been distorted, most of the important causes concealed. If the history of England is ever written by one who has the knowledge and the courage, the world will be astonished. Benjamin Disraeli, Prime Minister of Great Britain. Ancient England. King Offa ruled the Kingdom of Mercia, which was bounded by the rivers Trent and Mersey in the north, the Thames Valley in the south, Wales in the west, and East Anglia and Essex in the east, from 757 to 791 AD. It was one of the 7 autonomous kingdoms of the Anglo-Saxon Heptarchy. Offa was a wise and able administrator and a kind-hearted leader. He established the first monetary system in England. On account of the scarcity of gold, he used silver for coinage and as a store of wealth. The standard unit of exchange was a pound of silver divided into 240 pennies. The pennies were stamped with a star, Old English stara, from which the word sterling is derived. In 787, King Offa introduced a statute prohibiting usury, viz., the charging of interest on money lent, a concept which dates back to the pagan era. The laws against usury were further entrenched by King Alfred, 865 to 899, who directed that the property of usurers be forfeited, while in 1050, Edward the Confessor, 1042 to 1066, decreed not only forfeiture, but that a usurer be declared an outlaw and be banished for life. First Jewish migration and expulsion. The Jews first arrived in England in 1066 in the wake of William I's defeat of King Harold II at Hastings on the 14th of October. These Jews came from Rouen, 75 miles, 121 kilometers, from Falaise in Normandy, where William the Conqueror was born illegitimately as William the Bastard. Although the historical record does not indicate whether they promoted the idea of a military invasion of England, these Jews had at the very least financed it. For this support, they were richly rewarded by being allowed to practice usury under royal protection. The consequences for the English people were disastrous. By charging rates of interest of 33% per annum on lands mortgaged by nobles and 300% per annum on tools of trade or chattels pledged by workmen, within 2 generations, 1/4 of all English lands were in the hands of Jewish usurers. At his death in 1186, Aaron of Lincoln was declared to be the richest man in England, and it was estimated that his wealth exceeded that of King Henry II. Furthermore, the Jewish immigrants undermined the ethos of the guilds and exasperated the English merchants by selling a large variety of goods under one roof. They also played a prominent role in the clipping of silver coins and the melting of them into bullion and the plating of tin with silver. The famous economist, Dr. William Cunningham, compares the activity of the Jews in England from the 11th century onward to a sponge, which sucks up all the wealth of the land and thereby hinders all economic development. Interesting, too, is the proof that even at this early period, the government did everything in its power to make the Jews take up decent trades and honest work, and thereby, at the same time, amalgamate with the rest of the population, but all to no purpose. By the beginning of the 13th century, many nobles were in danger of losing their lands through usury and taxation. In 1207, an enormous sum of £60,000 was levied in taxes on the Christian population. The Jews also paid tax, but at a lower rate and on grossly understated income and wealth. Nobles who borrowed from Jewish moneylenders and from the king and his agents had to have their mortgages registered on the treasury rolls. As soon as a noble got into financial difficulty, the king would buy the debt from the moneylender and seize the land for himself. King John, 1199 to 1216, was utterly reckless in pursuit of this depraved and dishonest policy, and was moreover profligate, incompetent, and utterly beholden to his Jews. In 1215, the nobles revolted and forced King John to sign the Magna Carta on the 15th of June, 1215. This document consists of 61 clauses relating to the establishment of various constitutional and legal rights, but its principal purpose was to cancel the bonds of the Jewish moneylenders and to abolish usury and the privileged position of the Jews. On the 19th of October, 1216, King John died and was succeeded by his 9-year-old son Henry III, who ruled from 1219 to 1272. His reign was little better than that of his father, and 19 of the clauses affecting the Jews were abrogated the following year. However, his heir, Edward I, from 1272 to 1307, soon realized that Jews had no place in English society, and that if he did not take action, he would be in danger of losing his throne. In 1233 and 1275, statutes of Jewry were passed which abolished all forms of usury. As many of these Jews could no longer earn a living, a statute was passed by King Edward on the 18th of July 1290, compelling the entire Jewish population of 16,511 to leave England forever, one of over 100 expulsions which have been recorded throughout European history. The announcement was greeted with great joy and jubilation throughout the land. Unlike the modern practice of ethnic cleansing, the Jews, after paying a tax of 1/15 of the value of their movables and 1/10 of their specie, were permitted to leave with all their goods and chattels. Any Jew who remained after the 1st of November 1290, All Saints' Day, was liable to be executed. The glorious Middle Ages. With the banishment of the moneylenders and the abolition of usury, taxes were moderate and there was no state debt, as the interest-free tally stick was used for government expenditures. This ancient instrument of finance, known to the Saracens and possibly also to the Chinese, is derived from the Latin word talia, meaning a stick. A tally stick was made out of hazel, willow, or boxwood because these woods split easily. They were usually 8 inches in length, 20.3 centimeters, from forefinger to thumb, and half an inch, 1.3 centimeters wide, although they could be up to 8 feet, 2.44 meters long. The denominations were indicated by different sized cuts in the wood. 1,000 pounds were marked by cutting out the thickness of the palm of a hand, 100 pounds by the breadth of the little finger, 1 pound that of a swelling barley corn, shillings somewhat less, and pence were marked by incisions. The payee was recorded on the flat sides. When all the details had been recorded on the tally, it was split nearly to the bottom so that one part retained a stump or handle on which a hole could be bored. This was known as the counter-tally or counterfoil and was held on a rod at the exchequer. The flat strip, without the stump, was given to the payee. As no two pieces of wood are identical, it was impossible to forge a tally stick. Tally sticks were first introduced during the reign of King Henry II from 1100 to 35 AD, and would remain in circulation until 1783. It was, however, during the period of 1290 to 1485 that tallies would reach their apogee and constitute the principal means of state finance. Tallies were used not only to pay state salaries, but to finance major items of infrastructure, such as construction of the wall of the City of London and public buildings and ports. The exact amount of tallies in circulation is not known, but as late as 1694, 17 million pounds worth were still in existence. This was a prodigious sum, as the king's annual budget rarely exceeded 2.5 million pounds, and a laborer earned a penny a day. With tolerable taxes, no state debt, and no interest to pay, England enjoyed a period of unparalleled growth and prosperity. The average laborer worked only 14 weeks and enjoyed 160 to 180 holidays. According to Lord William Leverhulme, a writer of that time, the men of the 15th century were very well paid. In fact, so well paid that the purchasing power of their wages and their standard of living would only be exceeded in the late 19th century. A laborer could provide for all the necessities his family required. They were well clothed in good woolen cloth and had plenty of meat and bread. Houston Stewart Chamberlain, the Anglo-German philosopher, confirms these living conditions in his The Foundations of the 19th Century. In the 13th century, when the Teutonic races began to build their new world, the agriculturalist over nearly the whole of Europe was a freer man, with a more assured existence than he is today. Copyhold was the rule, so that England, for example, today a seat of landlordism, was even in the 15th century almost entirely in the hands of thousands of farmers, who were not only legal owners of their land, but possessed in addition far-reaching free rights to common pastures and woodlands. During their spare hours, many craftsmen volunteered their skills in building some of England's magnificent cathedrals, which reinforces one of the basic tenets of Western civilization that, without leisure time, the fostering of culture is not possible. George Macaulay Trevelyan, the English social historian, describes these accomplishments as follows. The continuous but ever-moving tradition of ecclesiastical architecture still proceeded on its majestic way, filling England with towering forests of masonry of which the beauty and grandeur have never been rivaled either by the ancients or the moderns. In the newer churches, the light no longer crept but flooded in, through the stained glass, of which the secret is today even more completely lost than the magic of the architecture. Although King Henry VIII, 1509 to 1547, relaxed the laws regarding usury in 1509, they were subsequently repealed by his son, King Edward VI, 1547 to 1553, by an act of 1552, whose preamble stated that usury is by word of God utterly prohibited as a vice most odious and detestable. End of a golden era. During the 17th century, this golden era came to a tragic end. Large numbers of Jews, who had been expelled from Spain in 1492 by Isabella I of Castile and Ferdinand II of Aragon on account of their persistent involvement in usury and unethical business practices, had settled in Holland. Although the Dutch were at that time an important maritime power, the Jewish usurers based in Amsterdam desired to return to England, where their prospects for expanding the operations of their money-lending empire were far more promising. During the reign of Queen Elizabeth I, 1558 to 1603, small numbers of Marranos, Spanish Jews who had converted to a sham form of Christianity, settled in London. Many of them practiced as goldsmiths, accepting deposits of gold for safekeeping, and then issuing 10 times the amount of gold received as gold receipts, that is, loans with interest. These receipts, a forerunner of the fraudulent fractional reserve system of banking, were initially lent to the Crown or Treasury at 8% per annum, but according to Samuel Pepys, the diarist and secretary to the Admiralty, the interest rate increased to as much as 20% and even 30% per annum. The rate of interest merchants paid often exceeded 33% per annum, even though the legal rate was only 6% per annum. Workmen and poor people bore the brunt of these extortionate rates of interest by having to pay 60%, 70%, or even 80% per annum. According to Michael Godfrey, the author of a pamphlet entitled A Short Account of the Bank of England, 2 to 3 million pounds had been lost through the bankruptcies of goldsmiths and the disappearance of their clerks. Cromwell and the English Civil War. In 1534, by the Act of Supremacy, the Church of England was established as the official religion of England by King Henry VIII. During the 16th and 17th centuries, Puritan beliefs based on the teachings of John Wycliffe and John Calvin gained an increasing number of adherents. The Puritans considered the Bible to be the true law of God and emphasized Bible reading, prayer, and preaching, and the simplification of the ritual of the sacraments. The Stuart King Charles I, 1625 to 1649, who wished to maintain the preeminence of the Anglican Church, came into intensified conflict with the Puritans, who were making great progress in proselytizing the population. After the assassination of Charles's trusted friend and advisor, the Duke of Buckingham in 1628, he gradually became more isolated. The growing religious division provided a perfect opportunity for exploitation by the Jewish conspirators. As Isaac Disraeli, the father of Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, wrote in The Life and Reign of Charles I, the nation was artfully divided into Sabbatarians and Sabbath breakers. In 1640, one of the leaders of the clandestine Jewish community, Fernandez Carvajal, a merchant and spy, who was also known as the Great Jew, organized an armed militia of about 10,000 operatives, who were used to intimidate the people of London and sow confusion. Large numbers of pamphlets and leaflets were also distributed. Civil war soon followed between the Royalists, Anglicans, and the Roundheads, Puritans, and lasted from 1642 to 1648. The Roundheads, with their New Model Army, were victorious, and an estimated 190,000 persons, or 3.8% of the population, died. The leader of the Roundheads was Oliver Cromwell, 1599 to 1658, whose New Model Army was not only outfitted and provisioned by the chief contractor and professional agitator Fernandez Carvajal, but also bankrolled by Jewish moneylenders in Amsterdam. The leader of the Dutch Jews, Manasseh ben Israel, sent begging petitions to Cromwell asking that the Jews be allowed to immigrate to England in return for the financial favors which he had so generously arranged. The regicide of King Charles I. The treachery to which Cromwell descended is revealed in correspondence between himself and the Synagogue of Molheim, Germany. 16th of June 1647, from O.C. Oliver Cromwell to Ebenezer Pratt. In return for financial support, Will advocate admission of Jews to England. This, however, impossible while Charles living. Charles cannot be executed without trial, adequate grounds for which do not at present exist. Therefore, advised that Charles be assassinated, but will have nothing to do with arrangements for procuring an assassin, though willing to help in his escape. In reply was dispatched the following: 12th of July, 1647, to O.C. from Ebenezer Pratt. Will grant financial aid as soon as Charles removed and Jews admitted. Assassination too dangerous. Charles will be given an opportunity to escape. His recapture will make trial and execution possible. The support will be liberal, but useless to discuss terms until trial commences. King Charles was staying as a virtual prisoner in Holmby House, Northamptonshire. On the 4th of June, 1647, 500 revolutionaries seized the king, but then allowed him to escape to the Isle of Wight, where he was subsequently arrested. On the 5th of September, 1648, the House of Commons decided that the king's concessions were satisfactory to a settlement. Cromwell then purged the House of Commons with the assistance of Colonel Pride until there was only a rump of 50 members left, who then duly voted that the king be put on trial. Not a single English lawyer was prepared to draw up a charge sheet against the king. Eventually, it was provided by a Dutch Jew, Isaac Dorislaus. The king was forced to participate in a show trial in a high court of justice in which 2/3 of its members were levelers from the army. Charles refused to plead, but was found guilty and executed on the 30th of January, 1649. As the procession approached the scaffold, large numbers of the crowd shouted, "God save the king!" After the deed had been done, there was an enormous groan of anguish. Second Jewish migration. From the 7th to the 18th of December, 1655, Cromwell, who was called the Protector, held a conference in Whitehall, London, in order to obtain approval for the large-scale immigration of Jews. In spite of the conference being packed with Cromwell's supporters, the overwhelming consensus of the delegates, who were mainly priests, lawyers, and merchants, was that the Jews should not be permitted to enter England. In October 1656, the first Jews were surreptitiously allowed to land freely in England, in spite of strong protests having been lodged by the subcommittee of the Council of State, who declared that these Jews would be a grave menace to the state and the Christian religion. The merchants, without exception, spoke against the admission of the Jews. They declared that the proposed immigrants would be morally harmful to the state and that their admission would enrich foreigners at the expense of the English. Cromwell died on the 3rd of September 1658 and was succeeded by his son, Richard, who ruled for 9 months. Charles I's son, Charles II, 1660 to 1685, succeeded his executed father. Although he would be the last English monarch to issue money, banknotes, in his own right, he made 2 fatal errors of governance. On the 1st of August 1663, he passed the euphemistically sounding Act for the Encouragement of Trade, which enabled the export of all foreign coins or bullion or gold or silver, free of interdict, regulation, or duties of any kind. During the debate on the bill, the Earl of Anglesey presciently observed that it is dangerous to the peace of the kingdom when it shall be in the power of half a dozen or half a score of rich, discontented, or factious persons to make a bank and accumulation of our own coin and bullion beyond the seas and leave us in want of money when it shall not, no longer, be in the king's power to prevent it. 3 years later, by means of an Act for the Encouragement of Coinage, he permitted private persons, i.e. bankers and goldsmiths, to mint the coins of the realm at the royal mint and thereby acquire the considerable benefits of the seigniorage, the difference between the face value of coins and their production costs, income for their own private account. Furthermore, it enabled them to increase or diminish the supply of money in circulation and to raise or lower prices at will to the great detriment of the general population. His brother, James II, 1685 to 1688, reign only lasted 3 years. He was a victim of unscrupulous pamphleteering and propaganda, which emanated mainly from Holland. A military expedition undertaken by Prince William of Orange eventually dethroned him. Although James's army was numerically superior, he was discouraged from attacking after John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, suddenly deserted him. According to the Jewish Encyclopedia, Churchill subsequently received an annual stipend of £6,000 for the Dutch Jew Solomon de Medina in payment for his treasonous conduct. These vast sums of blood money enabled Churchill to proceed with the construction of Blenheim Palace, which was completed at his death in 1722. William of Orange's military campaign, like that of the other William the Conqueror in 1066, was financed by Jewish bankers. In return for their support, William III, 1689 to 1702, would surrender the royal prerogative of issuing England's money free of debt and interest to a consortium known as the Governor and Company of the Bank of England. A. N. Field, in All These Things, summarizes these epical events known as the Glorious Revolution of 1688, but which was in effect the infamous revolution, as follows. 33 years after Cromwell had let the Jews into Britain, a Dutch prince arrived from Amsterdam surrounded by a whole swarm of Jews from that financial center. Driving his royal father-in-law, James II, out of the kingdom, he graciously consented to ascend the throne of Britain. A very natural result following on this event was the inauguration of the national debt by the establishment 6 years later of the Bank of England for the purpose of lending money to the crown. Britain had paid her way as she went until the Jews arrived. The pawnshop was then opened, and the resulting situation in which the nation finds itself today could not be better described than in the words put by Shakespeare with prophetic vision in the mouth of the dying John of Gaunt. This land of such dear souls, this dear, dear land, dear for her reputation through the world, is now leased out, I die pronouncing it, like to a tenement or pelting farm. England, bound in with the triumphant sea, whose rocky shore beats back the envious siege of watery Neptune, is now bound in with shame, with inky blots and rotten parchment bonds. That England, that was wont to conquer others, hath made a shameful conquest of itself. Richard II, Act 2, Scene 1. The history of the second Jewish settlement in Britain is one long trail of parchment bonds shackling the nation in debt. Every step of the ascent of the Jew in the nation's affairs has been marked by the increase and multiplication of debt. Establishment of the Bank of England. The need for a privately owned central bank was fronted by a retired pirate, William Paterson, when he wrote a pamphlet in 1693 entitled A Brief Account of the Intended Bank of England. He would later boast that this bank hath the benefit of interest on all moneys which it creates out of nothing. On Thursday, the 21st of June 1694, subscription lists for the bank, which had a capital of £1.2 million, were opened. By the following Monday, this amount had been fully subscribed. The ostensible purpose of the bank was to lend King William unlimited sums at 8% per annum to enable the prosecution of war, and in particular, the conflict against Louis XIV of France, whose country was not on the usury system. The bank would thus receive from the crown interest of £100,000 per annum, the additional £4,000 being an administrative fee. The bank also acquired the right to issue £1.2 million in banknotes without any gold cover. Prior to its listing, the bylaws of the bank were carefully scrutinized by Sergeant-at-Law Cresswell Levins in order to ensure that the bank complied with its hidden purpose, viz., to fleece the English people in perpetuity by allowing the creation of the nation's money and means of exchange out of nothing at interest. All of this fake money was to be accompanied by compounding interest. Levins was a crypto-Jew, or Marrano, who practiced as an advocate and later served as a judge. There was much opposition to the establishment of the bank. Foremost were the goldsmiths and moneylenders, who correctly foresaw that it would bring an end to their usurious racket of fractional reserve banking based on their gold receipts. Landowners and country gentry feared an escalation in interest rates, as the bank would control the nation's money supply. There were allegations that the bank would favor certain merchants with low rates of interest. The biggest fear was that the bank would grow too powerful and would become the keystone of the commercial world. Unfortunately, this is exactly what happened, as the Bank of England became the model on which all subsequent central banks were replicated. At that time, the House of Commons had 514 members consisting of 243 Tories, 241 Whigs, and 28 members whose allegiance was unknown. About two-thirds of the members were country gentlemen, and it is believed that of the 514 members, approximately 20% were illiterate. The bill was debated in July 1694, the high point in summer, when most of the rural members were engaged in summer pursuits and the harvesting of their crops. On that fateful Friday, the 27th of July 1694, when the Charter of Incorporation was granted, only 42 members were present, all of them Whigs, as the Tories opposed the bill, who all voted in favor of it. This begs the question as to what a quorum consisted of in those days. The title of the bill made no mention of the proposed Bank of England, which is only described, or one might say, secreted, two-thirds down in the unintelligible verbiage, to the layman that is, of the bill. The opening sentence of the bill reads as follows: William and Mary, by the grace of God, King and Queen of England, Scotland, France, and Ireland, defenders of the faith, etc., to all for whom these presents shall come greeting. The third sentence, which contains 242 words, starts, whereas in and by a certain act lately made in Parliament, entitled an Act for granting to their Majesties several rates and duties upon tonnage of ships and vessels, and upon beer, ale, and other liquors, for securing certain recompenses and advantages in the said Act mentioned, to such persons as shall voluntarily advance the sum of £1,500,000 toward carrying on the war with France, it is amongst other things enacted. The gist of the final two-thirds of the bill details the necessity to levy a complicated array of new rates, duties, and taxes on ships, beer, ale, and other liquors. The true purpose of these taxes was that they were needed in order to fund the interest on all future government loans. Shortly thereafter, further taxes were introduced, including a land tax, paper tax, poll tax, salt tax, stamp tax, and window tax, which replaced the hearth or chimney tax. Other taxes initiated were a tax on peddlers, a tax on hackney coaches, a tax on births, marriages, and deaths, and lastly, a tax on bachelors. However, the most punitive tax introduced was an income tax, levied at a rate of 20%. It was applied not only to companies, but laborers too. War and debt slavery in perpetuity. Henceforth, a pattern would emerge where unnecessary wars would be embarked upon which simultaneously increased the national debt and the profits of the usurers. Significantly, most of these wars were started against countries that had implemented interest-free state banking systems, as was the case in the North American colonies and France under Napoleon. This pattern of attacking and enforcing the bankers' system of usury had been deployed widely in the modern era and includes the defeats of Imperial Russia in World War I, Germany, Italy, and Japan in World War II, and most recently, Libya in 2011. These were all countries which had state banking systems, which distributed the wealth of their respective nations on an equitable basis and provided their populations with a standard of living far superior to that of their rivals and contemporaries. Within 2 years of its establishment in 1696, the Bank of England had £1.75 million worth of banknotes circulating with a gold reserve of only 2%, or £36,000. On the 1st of May 1707, the union between Scotland and England was established, motivated in no small way by the necessity to seize control of the Royal Mint in Edinburgh, which took place in 1709. In 1720, after the conclusion of the War of the Spanish Succession, 1701 to 1714, the national debt had risen to £30 million, with the war itself having cost £50 million. After the American War of Independence, 1775 to 1783, which had been fought after the colonists had been forced to replace their debt and largely interest-free colonial scrip with English money and had resulted in 50% unemployment, the national debt soared to £176 million. According to Sir John Harold Clapham, who wrote The Bank of England, A History, 1694 to 1914, in 1944, Solomon de Medina and two de Costas, Fonseca, Henriquez, Mendez, Nunez, Rodriguez, Salvador, and Tejera de Matos, who were all Sephardic Jews, had acquired the majority of the bank's shares by 1722. In 1786, Prime Minister William Pitt the Younger tried to abolish the national debt with a sinking fund which generated interest of £1 million per annum to repay the debt. This scheme was soon abandoned because of the enormous increase in loans incurred to finance the war against Napoleon. In 1797, in order to pay for the burgeoning interest burden, a system of graduated income tax had to be introduced, which by 1815 was yielding £70 million per annum. The war against France lasted from 1792 until 1815. Among the principal objectives of this pointless bloodletting was to destroy Napoleon's debt and interest-free system of finance. See Chapter 3. During this period, England also waged a war against the United States from 1812 until 1814. This war, as was the case with the war against France, was instigated by England at the behest of banker Mayer Amschel Rothschild, real name Bauer, after the United States Congress refused to renew the charter of the Rothschild-controlled Bank of the United States, which had been the Central Bank of America from 1791 until 1811. Mayer Amschel Rothschild is famously credited with having said, "Give me control of the economics of a country, and I care not who makes her laws. The few who understand the system will either be so interested from its profits or so dependent on its favors that there will be no opposition from that class." British Prime Minister Spencer Perceval, 1809 to 1812, tried to stop this completely feudal war, but was assassinated on the 11th of May 1812 in the lobby of the House of Commons by John Bellingham, a political radical who had been set up by Rothschild. By 1815, the national debt had ballooned to £885 million. This completely unnecessary war resulted in approximately 3 million military personnel and at least 1 million civilians losing their lives. In order to destroy Napoleon State Bank, it cost the deluded British public a staggering £831 million, of which over £2.5 billion were still outstanding in 1914. The principal of £504 million had over the intervening period increased fivefold as a result of the compounding effect of interest. An astute agrarian and parliamentarian, William Cobbett, 1763 to 1835, at that time perceived what was afoot and wrote as follows: "I sat to read the Act of Parliament by which the Bank of England was created. The investors knew what they were about. Their design was to mortgage by degrees the whole country, lands, houses, property, labor. The scheme had produced what the world never saw before: starvation in the midst of abundance." In 1800, a member of Parliament, Sir William Pulteney, proposed the formation of a national bank after having made vigorous attacks against the bank. In 1824, another member of Parliament, David Ricardo, submitted a detailed plan to convert the Bank of England into a national bank. Both attempts failed. The affairs of the Bank of England remained secret, and it was not until 1833, 139 years later, that a sanitized version of its accounts were presented to Parliament by means of the Act of 1833. At the start of World War I in 1914, the national debt stood at £650 million. On March 31, 1919, it had increased to £7.434 billion, of which £3 billion is still outstanding after 95 years at an interest rate of 3.5% per annum. In the 1919 budget, 40% of expenditure was allocated to the payment of interest. In World War II, the national debt rose by almost 300%, from £7.1 billion in 1939 to £20.1 billion in 1945. As of March 2017, it stands at over £1.8 trillion. However, if one includes all liabilities, including state and public pensions, it exceeds £5 trillion. Nationalization. On the 14th of February 1946, the Labour government nationalized the Bank of England. The shareholders received treasury notes to the value of £11,015,100, which were redeemable after 20 years. This nationalization, which supposedly placed the bank under public control, did not introduce any change to the privately run system of fractional reserve banking and was undertaken purely for propaganda purposes as part of the Labour Party's nationalization program of certain financial and industrial concerns. On the 6th of April 1974, the Bank of England established the Bank of England Nominees Limited, company registration number 1307478, a wholly owned subsidiary, with private shareholders holding its £100 shares, of which 50% were sold. There is a suspicion that this rearrangement of the bank's affairs represents a reverse takeover of it by private shareholders. In view of the fact that certain aspects of the Bank of England's operations are protected by its Royal Charter, Section 27(9) of the Companies Act of 1976, and the Official Secrets Act of 1989, and are therefore not subject to public and parliamentary scrutiny, there may well be substance to this allegation.